I was a mechanic accused of theft, so I exposed their illegal chop shop operation. But that afternoon, when Danny Kruger's meaty finger jabbed toward the exit door, his eyes burning with false righteousness, I didn't yet know the depth of corruption festering beneath Kruger's auto repair like oil-soaked concrete. The missing alternator sat on his desk like evidence at a trial. Chrome gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Serial numbers filed clean. My hands, still black with honest grease, trembled slightly as Kruger's accusations hung in the air between us. 23 years I'd worked on engines. 23 years of arriving early, staying late, fixing what others couldn't. And now this. The security footage played on his laptop screen. Grainy black and white, a figure moving through the shop after hours. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. Tuesday night. The same night I'd stayed late to finish Mrs. Patterson's transmission. The same night I'd used my key, the key Kruger had given me himself 3 years ago when he promoted me to lead mechanic. But the figure on screen looked wrong. Too tall. Wrong gait. I studied the pixelated shadows, noting how the person moved with unfamiliar confidence through the parts storage area. How they knew exactly where to find the high-value alternators. How they avoided the motion sensor near the tool cabinet that would have triggered the alarm. Kruger's face remained stone cold as he pointed at the screen, his thick arms crossed over his barrel chest. Behind him, Tony Valdez leaned against the filing cabinet, picking his teeth with a toothpick. Tony had been Kruger's right hand for 15 years. They'd hired me fresh out of trade school, back when I believed hard work and loyalty meant something. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. My keycard accessed the building at 11:43 p.m. The cameras showed someone in coveralls moving through the shop. 3 alternators went missing that night. Expensive ones, worth nearly $2 grand total. And I was the only employee who'd been in the building after hours. What they didn't mention was how I'd called in the next morning to report the missing parts myself. How I discovered the theft when I came in early to prep for the day's work. How I'd immediately notified Kruger and suggested checking the security footage. Kruger shut the laptop with a sharp click. The sound echoed off the concrete walls of his office like a gavel. He slid a folded paper across the desk. Termination notice. Effective immediately. No severance. And worse, they were filing a police report. My hand stayed steady as I unfolded the document. 23 years of perfect attendance. 23 years without a single customer complaint. 23 years of building Kruger's reputation one repair at a time. All reduced to a single sheet of paper citing theft of company property. The injustice burned in my chest like swallowed gasoline. But I kept my expression neutral. Nodded once, folded the paper and slipped it into my coverall pocket. Kruger's eyes followed my movements, searching for rage, for desperate denials, for the emotional breakdown that would confirm his narrative. He found none. I turned toward my toolbox, my personal tools accumulated over decades of work. Each wrench, each socket, each diagnostic device purchased with my own money. Kruger's voice stopped me before I reached the red Snap-on cabinet. He gestured toward the exit. My tools would be searched and inventoried before I could reclaim them. Standard procedure for terminated employees suspected of theft. The humiliation was intentional, public, designed to break whatever dignity remained. But as I walked past the other mechanics, Jimmy, Carlos, the new kid whose name I'd forgotten, I caught something in their eyes. Not judgment, not condemnation. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing you could be next. From understanding that loyalty and years of service meant nothing when you became inconvenient. The afternoon sun hit my face as I stepped into the parking lot. My pickup truck sat alone in the employee section, dwarfed by Kruger's custom Escalade and Tony's lifted Silverado. 23 years, and all I had to show for it was a 10-year-old Ford and a growing suspicion that something deeper was happening at Kruger's auto repair. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad and a pen. The termination notice lay flat beside my coffee cup, its corporate language stark against the worn Formica table. I'd spent the drive home replaying every detail from the security footage. The timestamp, the figure's movements, the precise knowledge of where to find the most valuable parts. Someone had used my keycard. Someone who knew the shop's layout intimately. Someone who understood which parts would be worth stealing and which areas to avoid. The more I considered it, the more convinced I became that this wasn't random theft. This was orchestrated, planned, executed with inside knowledge. But why frame me? What made me a target? The answer came at 2 a.m. when sleep refused to arrive and my mind kept circling back to the past few months. The late-night overtime requests that had become more frequent. The expensive cars that appeared in the shop after hours. Vehicles I'd never seen during regular business hours. The hushed conversations between Kruger and Tony that stopped whenever I approached. And the parts orders. Always large quantities of high-end components that never seemed to match the work we were doing during the day. Alternators, transmissions, ECUs, expensive items that could be easily resold. I'd questioned the inventory discrepancies once, mentioning to Kruger that our parts usage seemed inconsistent with our logged repairs. His response had been immediate and sharp. Mind your own business. Focus on the work assigned to you. Let management handle inventory concerns. Now, staring at the ceiling in my empty bedroom, I understood. Kruger's auto repair wasn't just fixing cars. They were stealing them, stripping them, selling parts on the black market. And I'd gotten too close to the truth. The accusation of theft wasn't justice. It was elimination. I rose before dawn and drove to the public library. The elderly librarian recognized me. I'd been bringing my nephew here for research projects before he moved away for college. She nodded toward the computer terminals without question. The internet search began simply. Kruger's Auto Repair, business licenses, Better Business Bureau complaints, local news mentions. What I found painted a picture of a shop that had transformed dramatically over the past 5 years. Customer reviews told the story. Early reviews praised honest work and fair prices. But recent reviews were different. Complaints about overcharging, accusations of unnecessary repairs. Several customers mentioned work being delayed for days or weeks without explanation. More telling were the reviews that had been removed. I could see gaps in the timeline where negative feedback had clearly been deleted or suppressed. But cached versions revealed complaints about missing vehicles. Customers who'd brought cars in for routine maintenance only to be told days later that additional damage had been discovered. Damage that would cost thousands to repair. A pattern emerged. Expensive vehicles came in for simple repairs. Customers were told about extensive additional problems. While the cars sat in the shop for extended periods, parts were systematically removed and replaced with cheaper alternatives. The customers, faced with massive repair bills, often abandoned their vehicles rather than pay. Those abandoned vehicles never made it to the impound lot. I expanded my search to include Tony Valdez. His social media presence was minimal but revealing. Pictures of a lifestyle that far exceeded what a shop foreman should afford. New Harley-Davidson motorcycle, expensive fishing boat, recent vacation photos from the Bahamas. Kruger's online footprint was more careful, but equally telling. His house had been purchased 18 months ago for $400,000 cash. No mortgage, no loan history. The property records showed he'd bought and sold 3 other properties in the past 2 years, always for cash, always at significant profits. The business registration documents revealed another layer. Kruger's Auto Repair was a subsidiary of Mountain Valley Holdings, which was itself owned by a shell company registered in Delaware. The web of ownership was deliberately complex, designed to obscure the true source of funding and profits. But the most damning evidence came from cross-referencing police reports with the shop's customer database. I'd memorized hundreds of license plates over the years, a habit developed from 2 decades of managing customer vehicles. Those plates started appearing in stolen vehicle reports filed in neighboring counties, never locally. Always far enough away that the connection wouldn't be obvious. Always expensive cars. BMWs, Mercedes, Audis, high-end trucks. Vehicles that had supposedly been abandoned at Kruger's shop or sold for parts to cover repair costs. The scope of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested they were moving 50 to 70 vehicles per year through their laundering scheme. At an average value of $30,000 per vehicle, that represented over $2 million in annual revenue. And I'd stumbled too close to their secret. The library's closing announcement interrupted my research. 6 hours had passed without notice. I printed the most relevant documents, cleared the browser history, and gathered my materials. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial. Nothing that would hold up in court without additional proof. I needed inside access. I needed documentation. I needed to catch them in the act. But first, I needed to understand their security measures. That evening, I drove past the shop 3 times, noting the camera positions, the lighting patterns, the neighboring businesses. Kruger's sat on an industrial road between a defunct furniture warehouse and a small engine repair shop that closed at 5 p.m. Perfect isolation for after-hours activities. The security system was more sophisticated than I'd remembered. New cameras covered angles that hadn't been monitored during my employment. Motion sensors protected the perimeter. But 23 years of working in that building had given me knowledge that cameras couldn't capture. The old storm drain that ran beneath the shop. Installed in the 1980s when the building was constructed, it connected to the city's main drainage system. The access point was hidden behind the dumpster in the rear parking lot, covered by a rusted grate that hadn't been opened in years. During heavy rains, we'd occasionally had flooding in the basement storage area. I'd crawled through that drain system twice to clear blockages. The tunnel was tight but navigable. More importantly, it emerged inside the building in the basement utility room, well below the camera coverage. But infiltration was only part of the challenge. I needed to document their activities without being detected. I needed evidence that would be admissible in court. And I needed an exit strategy that wouldn't result in my own arrest or disappearance. The plan began to take shape over the following weeks. First, I established a new routine. Morning coffee at the diner across from the police station. Afternoon visits to the library for continued research. Evening dinners at the sports bar 3 blocks from Kruger's shop. Always visible, always accounted for. Building an alibi that would withstand scrutiny. During these visits, I observed the patterns. Kruger and Tony arrived together most mornings around 7 a.m. The regular mechanics, Jimmy, Carlos, and the others, departed by 6 p.m. But Kruger and Tony often stayed later, sometimes until 9 or 10 p.m., always on nights when expensive vehicles had been brought in for repairs. The stolen cars arrived after midnight. I confirmed this by positioning myself in the parking lot of an all-night laundromat with a clear view of Kruger's rear entrance. Flatbed trucks, legitimate-looking vehicles with proper commercial plates. But the cars being unloaded were clearly high-end models, and they disappeared into the shop's service bays without any paperwork or customer interaction. By day 3 of surveillance, I documented license plates for 6 stolen vehicles. Cross-referencing with online databases confirmed that all 6 had been reported stolen within the past month, all from locations more than 100 miles away. The operation was more sophisticated than simple theft. This was organized crime, complete with transportation networks, documentation forgery, and parts distribution channels. Kruger wasn't just running a chop shop. He was managing a regional hub for a larger criminal organization. That realization changed everything. This wasn't about getting my job back or clearing my name. This was about dismantling a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The stakes were higher, the risk greater, but the potential impact of exposure would be devastating to their entire network. I needed federal involvement. Local police might be compromised. Small-town departments often developed relationships with local businesses that could complicate investigations. But the FBI's Auto Theft Task Force would have the resources and independence to pursue the case properly. The challenge was gathering evidence that would trigger their interest. Federal agencies required substantial proof before opening investigations. Circumstantial evidence and surveillance photos wouldn't be sufficient. I needed inside documentation, financial records, vehicle identification numbers, correspondence that proved interstate trafficking. That meant infiltration. I spent 2 weeks preparing. Physical conditioning to navigate the drainage system efficiently. Research into their security protocols and camera blind spots. Most importantly, I acquired the tools necessary to document everything without detection. The miniature camera was purchased with cash from a surveillance equipment dealer in the next state over. Digital storage capable of 12 hours of high-definition recording. Wireless transmission capabilities that could upload footage to cloud storage in real time. Small enough to be concealed in various locations throughout the shop. The first penetration occurred on a Wednesday night during a thunderstorm. Perfect cover. The rain would mask any sounds and the storm would provide an excuse for any drainage system activity that might be detected. The access point was exactly as I remembered. The grate lifted easily once the accumulated debris was cleared. The tunnel was tight but navigable, though 23 years had added enough weight to make the journey more challenging than I'd anticipated. The basement utility room was dark and empty. No cameras as expected. It was purely functional space with no valuable inventory. But the mechanical sounds from above confirmed that work was in progress. The shop was active despite the late hour. Moving through the basement required patience and precision. Every step had to be silent. Every movement calculated to avoid detection. But familiarity with the building's layout provided significant advantages. I knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, which routes offered the most concealment. The first camera was positioned in the main service bay, hidden inside a junction box that appeared to be part of the electrical system. The angle provided a clear view of the vehicle lifts and work areas where cars were being processed. The wireless signal was strong enough to transmit through the building structure to my receiver positioned outside. Installation took less than 2 minutes. But as I prepared to move to the second location, voices approached from the main entrance. Kruger and Tony, discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. Their footsteps echoed across the concrete floor, moving toward the service bays. Concealment was limited in the basement. I pressed against the wall behind the water heater, controlling my breathing, listening to their conversation filter down through the floor above. Their discussion revealed more than I'd hoped. References to a delivery scheduled for Friday night, concerns about increased police attention in neighboring counties, arguments about expanding operations versus maintaining security. Most importantly, Tony mentioned a contact named Morrison who was demanding higher fees for transportation services. The conversation suggested Morrison controlled the stolen vehicle pipeline, moving cars from theft locations to processing centers like Kruger's shop. They discussed specific vehicles by make, model, and VIN number. A white BMW X5 stolen from a mall parking lot in Hartford. A black Mercedes C-Class taken from a hotel valet in Springfield. Both vehicles were currently in the shop, being processed for parts removal and documentation forgery. The conversation lasted 18 minutes. When their voices finally moved away from the service bay, I installed 2 additional cameras, one overlooking the parts storage area, another focused on Kruger's office where paperwork and computer records would be accessible. The return journey through the drainage system was complicated by rising water levels from the storm. What had been a dry tunnel on entry was now flowing with several inches of runoff. The current was manageable but added urgency to the extraction. Getting trapped in a flooding storm drain would be difficult to explain. I emerged behind the dumpster soaked and muddy but undetected. The cameras were transmitting clearly, providing real-time footage of the shop's interior. The first phase of documentation had succeeded. Over the following week, the cameras captured extraordinary evidence. Detailed footage of stolen vehicles being dismantled. Close-ups of VIN numbers being altered or removed. Clear shots of Kruger and Tony sorting through stolen parts and documentation. But the most damning evidence came Friday night, when the delivery Morrison had mentioned arrived right on schedule. The footage showed a professional operation. 2 flatbed trucks arrived simultaneously at 11:47 p.m. The vehicles being unloaded were clearly high-end models. A Range Rover, a Porsche Cayenne, and a BMW 7 Series. All appeared to be in excellent condition, suggesting recent theft rather than abandoned vehicles. The unloading process was efficient and practiced. Each vehicle was immediately moved into a service bay and positioned on a lift. Within minutes, systematic dismantling began. Engines, transmissions, electronic modules, all removed with professional precision and sorted into organized storage areas. Most revealing was the documentation process. Each vehicle's paperwork was processed through a computer system that generated false registration documents, altered VIN plates, and forged inspection certificates. The level of sophistication suggested connections to state DMV databases or corrupt officials within the registration system. Tony operated the computer system while Kruger supervised the physical processing. Their efficiency indicated this wasn't a recent development. This operation had been refined over years of practice. The cameras also captured something unexpected. During the processing of the Range Rover, Jimmy arrived at the shop, not as a reluctant participant or unwilling witness, but as an active member of the operation. He immediately began removing the vehicle's electronics package with professional expertise. My former colleague, the mechanic I trained personally, was a willing participant in the criminal enterprise. The realization was professionally devastating, but strategically valuable. It confirmed that the operation involved multiple employees, strengthening the case for a widespread conspiracy. By Saturday morning, I had over 40 hours of incriminating footage. Vehicle thefts, parts processing, documentation forgery, and interstate transportation. Evidence that clearly demonstrated a sophisticated criminal enterprise operating across multiple jurisdictions. But more importantly, I had identified the key participants: Kruger as the operation leader, Tony as the technical specialist, Morrison as the transportation coordinator, and Jimmy as an additional conspirator. The network was larger and more organized than initially suspected. The evidence was sufficient to trigger federal investigation, but I wanted to maximize the impact. Simply turning over footage to authorities would result in arrests, but might not fully dismantle the network. Other participants could escape. Evidence could be destroyed. The operation could relocate and resume. I needed to coordinate the exposure for maximum effect. The plan required precise timing. Federal authorities needed sufficient notice to organize a coordinated response. Local police needed to be included to prevent jurisdictional complications. And media coverage needed to be arranged to ensure public accountability and prevent any potential cover-up attempts. I started with the FBI's Auto Theft Task Force. The initial contact was made through their anonymous tip line, providing basic information about the operation and offering to provide detailed evidence in exchange for a meeting with investigating agents. The response was immediate. Within 24 hours, Agent Sarah Chen contacted me through a secure phone number, requesting a preliminary meeting to assess the credibility of my claims. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a federal building in the state capitol. Agent Chen was professional but skeptical during our initial discussion. Auto theft rings were common, but the scope of operation I described required substantial evidence to justify federal resources. I provided her with a sample of the surveillance footage, just enough to demonstrate the sophistication of the evidence without revealing all my documentation. Her skepticism vanished within minutes of viewing the footage. The clear shots of VIN alteration, the professional dismantling processes, and the obvious interstate transportation elements immediately elevated the case to federal priority status. She requested the complete evidence package and outlined the federal response protocol. A joint task force would be assembled, including FBI agents, state police investigators, and local law enforcement. The raid would be coordinated to occur during active operations, maximizing the evidence collection and arrest potential. But Agent Chen also warned me about the personal risks. Criminal organizations of this sophistication often had connections to law enforcement, political officials, or other protective networks. My cooperation with the investigation could result in retaliation attempts, requiring federal witness protection considerations. The warning was sobering but not unexpected. Kruger's operation represented millions of dollars in annual revenue. People had been killed for far less money. But the injustice of my firing, combined with the scope of their criminal activities, made the risks acceptable. We scheduled the raid for the following Friday night, when surveillance indicated the next major vehicle delivery was planned. I would provide real-time intelligence about their activities while federal agents positioned themselves around the facility. The week preceding the raid was tense and surreal. I maintained my normal routine: coffee at the diner, research at the library, dinner at the sports bar. But every interaction carried the weight of knowing that I was preparing to destroy the lives and careers of people I'd worked alongside for decades. Jimmy's involvement was particularly difficult to process. I'd hired him myself, trained him on engine diagnostics, recommended him for promotions. His family situations had been discussed over countless coffee breaks. His children's school activities had been celebrated in the shop's break room. But the surveillance footage was unambiguous. He was an active, willing participant in criminal activities that had destroyed the livelihoods of countless theft victims. Whatever personal relationship we developed was overshadowed by his choice to participate in organized crime. Thursday night, I conducted the final surveillance penetration. The cameras needed to be repositioned for optimal coverage of Friday's expected activities. Additionally, I wanted to download any computer files that might provide additional evidence of their network connections. The infiltration was routine until I accessed Kruger's office computer. His security was minimal. A simple password that I'd observed him entering during legitimate work activities. But the files revealed information that transformed my understanding of the operation's scope. Kruger's auto repair was one of 12 similar operations across 3 states. The computer contained detailed records of vehicle transfers, parts sales, and financial distributions. Morrison wasn't just a transportation coordinator. He was the regional director of a criminal network that processed over 800 stolen vehicles annually. More disturbing were the law enforcement files, detailed information about local police patrol schedules, investigative procedures, and individual officer profiles. The level of detail suggested corruption within multiple police departments, providing the criminal network with advance warning of potential investigations. My name appeared in several files, not as a suspected criminal, but as a potential security risk. Notes indicated that my mechanical expertise and long tenure had made me a threat to operational security. The theft accusation hadn't been random retaliation. It had been a calculated elimination of a perceived threat. The files also revealed future expansion plans. New locations were being scouted in neighboring states. Recruitment of additional mechanics and administrative personnel was underway. The organization was growing rapidly, suggesting that law enforcement pressure had been minimal to date. I downloaded the complete file structure to an encrypted drive, then repositioned the cameras for optimal Friday night coverage. The evidence was now overwhelming. Not just proof of local criminal activity, but documentation of an interstate criminal enterprise with law enforcement corruption and plans for continued expansion. Friday evening arrived with clear skies and light traffic. Perfect conditions for surveillance and federal coordination. I positioned myself at the surveillance station, the abandoned gas station across from Kruger's shop, and established communication with Agent Chen's tactical team. The first unusual activity occurred at 9:30 p.m. Rather than the typical arrival of Kruger and Tony, 3 vehicles approached the shop simultaneously, 2 flatbed trucks and an unmarked sedan. The drivers appeared agitated, moving with urgency that suggested something had changed. Through the camera feeds, I watched Morrison emerge from the sedan. His body language was tense, his movements sharp and aggressive. He immediately engaged in heated discussion with Kruger and Tony, pointing toward the service bays and gesturing emphatically. Their conversation was clearly argumentative, though the audio quality was insufficient to capture specific words. But their behavior suggested crisis management rather than routine operations. Something had disrupted their normal procedures. The realization was immediate and chilling. They knew about the investigation. I contacted Agent Chen immediately, reporting the unusual activity and recommending immediate intervention. But federal protocols required additional confirmation before adjusting operational timelines. The task force was positioned and ready, but premature action could compromise the investigation if my assessment was incorrect. The cameras captured increasingly frantic activity inside the shop. Rather than unloading new stolen vehicles, Morrison's team was loading existing inventory onto the flatbed trucks. Parts, tools, computer equipment, everything was being evacuated rapidly. This wasn't a normal delivery. This was emergency liquidation. By 10:15 p.m., it became clear that the criminal network was abandoning the location. Whatever intelligence had prompted this evacuation was specific and credible. They knew about federal investigation. They knew about the planned raid, and they were implementing emergency protocols to minimize losses. Agent Chen's voice crackled through the radio with authorization for immediate intervention. Federal units would converge on the location within minutes, attempting to prevent the evacuation and preserve evidence. But even as I reported their positions and activities, I knew the timing was wrong. The criminals had too much advance warning, too much preparation time. They would escape with minimal losses, leaving behind a cleaned-out building and destroyed evidence. The first FBI vehicles arrived at 10:23 p.m. But by then, Morrison's convoy was already departing through the rear exit, carrying the most valuable inventory and computer equipment. The timing suggested they'd had at least an hour of advance warning, possibly more. The raid captured Kruger and Tony, along with 3 other associates who'd been left behind to complete the evidence destruction. Jimmy had apparently departed earlier, possibly warned by his criminal colleagues about the impending federal action. But Morrison escaped with the core of the operation intact. The computer servers, the financial records, the contact information for the broader network, all evacuated before federal agents could secure the scene. The raid was simultaneously a success and a failure. Sufficient evidence was recovered to prosecute the individuals arrested. Vehicle identification numbers, stolen parts, forged documentation. Enough proof to ensure convictions for auto theft, fraud, and conspiracy. But the broader criminal network remained intact. Morrison's organization would relocate, recruit new local operators, and resume activities within months. The disruption was temporary rather than permanent. Agent Chen's post-operation debrief confirmed my suspicions about law enforcement corruption. The investigation had been compromised from within. Someone with access to federal planning had warned the criminal network, allowing them to implement evacuation protocols before the raid occurred. The betrayal was professional, but not personal. Corrupt officials had protected a revenue source, not individuals. Kruger and Tony were expendable components of a larger machine. Their arrest was an acceptable loss in exchange for preserving the network's core operations. But my evidence had accomplished more than just arrests. The documentation I'd provided exposed the full scope of the criminal enterprise, providing federal investigators with intelligence about operations in multiple states. While Morrison's immediate network had escaped, the broader investigation would continue across jurisdictions. More importantly, the evidence cleared my name completely. The federal investigation confirmed that the theft accusation had been fabricated to eliminate a security threat. My termination was revealed as retaliation rather than legitimate discipline, opening Kruger's business to civil liability that would complete its destruction. The final phase of my revenge was bureaucratic but satisfying. Within weeks of the federal raid, Kruger's auto repair was officially closed by state regulators. The business license was revoked, the property was seized under federal asset forfeiture laws, and the building was sold to satisfy criminal judgment obligations. Kruger himself received a federal sentence of 12 years for conspiracy, auto theft, and fraud. Tony received 8 years as a cooperating witness who provided information about other network operations. Jimmy, who had disappeared before the raid, was arrested 6 months later in Colorado and extradited to face charges. But my personal vindication came through civil litigation. The fabricated theft accusation, my wrongful termination, and the deliberate destruction of my professional reputation created substantial legal liability. Kruger's personal assets, his insurance policies, and his business holdings were all subject to civil judgment. The settlement was substantial enough to fund early retirement. More importantly, it included public acknowledgement that the theft accusation had been fabricated, restoring my professional reputation and clearing my name throughout the industry. Agent Chen later informed me that my evidence had contributed to a broader federal investigation that resulted in over 40 arrests across 3 states. Morrison was eventually captured during a raid on a similar operation in Tennessee, along with computer records that exposed the complete organizational structure. The auto theft network was dismantled permanently. Their interstate operations were disrupted, their law enforcement contacts were identified and prosecuted, and their financial assets were seized under federal racketeering statutes. 6 months after my wrongful termination, I received an official letter from the FBI commending my cooperation with federal investigations. The letter specifically noted that my evidence had been instrumental in dismantling a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise and preventing hundreds of future auto thefts. But the most satisfying moment came during Kruger's sentencing hearing. Federal procedures allowed victim impact statements, providing me with an opportunity to address the court about the personal and professional damage caused by his criminal activities. I described 23 years of honest work, professional dedication, and loyalty to an employer who had repaid that loyalty with false accusations and deliberate destruction of my reputation. I explained how his criminal activities had contaminated a legitimate business, destroying the livelihoods of honest employees and the trust of customers who had relied on our services. Most importantly, I explained how his decision to frame me for theft had been the critical mistake that exposed his entire operation. His arrogance and willingness to destroy an innocent person had provided the motivation and opportunity for me to investigate, document, and ultimately expose his criminal network. Kruger sat at the defendant's table throughout my statement, his face impassive but his hands clenched into fists. The man who had once held absolute power over my livelihood was now facing over a decade in federal prison, his business destroyed, his reputation ruined, his criminal network dismantled. The judge's comments during sentencing addressed both the scope of the criminal enterprise and the importance of whistleblower cooperation in exposing organized crime. The case was cited as an example of how individual citizens could effectively assist law enforcement in combating sophisticated criminal operations. As I left the courthouse that day, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the previous year. I'd entered Kruger's office as a victim, falsely accused, professionally destroyed, personally humiliated. But I'd left the courthouse as something different. Someone who had chosen to fight back rather than accept injustice. Someone who had turned victimization into vindication. The revenge was complete, but it had evolved beyond simple retaliation. By exposing Kruger's criminal network, I'd prevented hundreds of future crimes. By cooperating with federal investigators, I'd helped dismantle an organization that had caused millions of dollars in damages to innocent victims. The wrongful termination that had seemed like professional devastation had become the catalyst for something larger. Justice. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had been victimized by Kruger's criminal enterprise. 3 years later, I operate my own automotive consulting business, specializing in fraud detection and insurance investigations. The skills I developed during my investigation of Kruger's operation proved valuable to legitimate businesses seeking to protect themselves from criminal infiltration. The work is satisfying in ways that routine mechanical repair never was. Each investigation represents an opportunity to prevent criminal activity, protect honest businesses, and ensure that justice prevails over corruption. Kruger remains in federal prison with 8 years remaining on his sentence. Morrison received 15 years and is serving his time in a maximum security facility in Texas. Tony was released after 5 years but remains under federal supervision. His career in the automotive industry permanently ended. Jimmy received 7 years but was released early for cooperation with ongoing investigations. He attempted to contact me once, seeking reconciliation and hoping to discuss potential employment opportunities. I declined the meeting. Some betrayals create permanent separations. But the most lasting impact of my experience wasn't professional or financial. It was the understanding that injustice doesn't have to be accepted passively, that corruption can be exposed and defeated, That individual citizens have more power than they realize when they choose to fight back intelligently and persistently. The security cameras I installed in Kruger's shop were never recovered by federal agents. They continue to transmit to cloud storage systems, providing an ongoing record of the building's current use as a legitimate tire repair business operated by an honest mechanic who purchased the property from federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Sometimes I review the footage, not from paranoia or obsession, but from satisfaction. The service bays where stolen vehicles were once dismantled now house honest repair work. The office where criminal conspiracies were planned now serves a legitimate business, providing valuable services to the community. The transformation is complete. Justice prevailed, and I learned that the best revenge isn't personal destruction. It's using the truth to create something better than what was destroyed. The man who falsely accused me of theft now wears a federal prison uniform, while I wear the satisfaction of knowing that his downfall was entirely of his own making. His arrogance and criminality provided the evidence for his own destruction. That knowledge alone is worth more than any settlement, more valuable than any vindication, more satisfying than any traditional revenge. Because in the end, the truth was the most powerful weapon available, and I learned how to use it with devastating precision.